The structure of the atom as a self-referential development. Even though we have seen great advances in the fields of fluid mechanics, quantum mechanics, and every area of research, science still cannot at all explain the turbulence observed in all scales of magnification. Turbulence is the only systemic observation of our universe which describes it fully, as we discern it in every level of observation from the microcosm to the macrocosm. Yet, as Heisenberg put it, even God could not possibly answer to such a question. Why turbulence? Well, according to the theory The Meaning of Order, existence is a self-referential development where everything is on a track to complete a circle, endlessly, that is, without a beginning or an end, while, on the contrary, our mind is always compelled to produce a mechanistic interpretation from an assumed beginning, axiom, or principle that also serves as a fixed frame of reference, rendering such a description always linear. Yet, self-referentiality offers no fixed frame of reference. Similarly, the rational description is always expanded in discrete consequential steps in such a way that it is always unable to curve back and confirm the original assumption, leaving the axioms and the principles used as beginnings always plausible but also unprovable, while additionally rendering the rational description linear as it is unable to curve. So, while the rational description can only produce a linear on the whole interpretation of reality from a fixed frame of reference, reality itself is an exclusively non-linear self-referential development that can only be considered as eternal and depicted as a continuous circling in all three dimensions, in such a way so as to always give birth to itself, just as depicted by chaos theory and the fractals. Furthermore, it will be understood that rationality could only accurately interpret events in linear space, simply because it is itself linear, while also it naturally assumes linearity of space, flat earth, flat space, etc. So, to obscure matters further, I will give you an exaggerated example by which one could never understand rationally that while aiming a gun towards the sky, one truly aims at oneself, simply because space is on the whole curved around a circle, while we naturally assume that space is linear. In fact, even the general theory of relativity, which was the first theory to challenge the linearity of space, still allowed space to be linear on the whole. The theory The Meaning of Order, though, demands that space is curved around a circle on the macrocosmic scale, as well as on the microcosmic, that is, the atom and the subatomic particles, while in between, which is the vicinity of the observer, and the field of application of the anthropic principle, everything is only virtually linear, allowing thus rationality to interpret the observer's surroundings virtually accurately. On the contrary, while attempting to provide a rational description of subatomic events, one gets nowhere. Similarly, linear descriptions of cosmogony like the Big Bang theory cannot account for the turbulence or for the nonlinear expansion observed, while also they cannot account for the missing matter, etc. In short, it will be understood that rationality is always compelled to impose linearity upon its description of reality. Any deviation from linearity always challenges rationality. This hopefully will become more cognitively digestible later on. It will be to your advantage to know that whenever I use the term linearity of the mind, I am referring to our mind's demand to always use a fixed frame of reference before a description is delivered for obvious reasons. Yet it will be understood that existence, being self-referential, offers no fixed frame of reference and is thus on the whole linearly undecipherable. What follows is a self-referential description of reality, which is always cyclical. It does not have a beginning and it is not linear. So help you God. This is a self-referential depiction of the atom of magnesium, where both electronic trajectories in the 1s subshell are depicted as a self-referential development showing a double helix of only one turn that additionally originates from and finally folds back to itself continuously. Just as the video The End of Segregation of Knowledge explains about the eternal development around the universe. Similarly, the 2s and 2p subshells are depicted the same way but with two turns, while the 3s subshell is depicted with three turns of the double helix and so on. I am currently trying to reconcile atomic theory with the meaning of order, only to show that while the atom cannot be described linearly, it can certainly be described self-referentially as being the universe itself, but observed from a different frame of reference. I assume that you already know that the universe, according to the theory, the meaning of order, is characterized by trajectories that curve continuously in all three dimensions, only to form a double helix of a single turn that originates from and finally folds back to itself continuously, while also these trajectories rest on the surface of a double torus that looks like an apple. In the case of the atom and the subatomic orbitals, the number of turns of the double helix is determined by the principal quantum number n, as used by Bohr. The radii of the electronic orbitals are also determined by the same quantum number. Sommerfeld's elliptical orbits are not depicted at first, so as to keep the model simple. Yet, I am currently using shells and subshells, both as being complete toruses or else apples. Elliptical orbitals, where within each one we can observe at maximum 2 electrons of opposite spin, will be discussed later on. You may like to find this Wikipedia page, Electron Shell, which has a few tables that will be useful to this analysis, like the table that shows the shells, the subshells, and of course a table that shows all the elements in the periodic table and where their electrons lie, like on the K shell, the L shell, the M shell, and so on. On your screen you can see the self-referential depiction of the magnesium atom. I have made the assumption that the atom of hydrogen, which is the lightest and simplest atom, is identical to the self-referential development around the universe. I hope that this assumption will be justified by your understanding of self-referentiality later on. The particular atom has only three shells called K, L, and M, depicted in blue, green, and red color. Shell K has only one subshell called 1s. Shell L has two subshells called 2s and 2p, while shell M of the particular atom has only one subshell called 3s. So it is easy to understand why I'm inclined to represent shell K with one turn of the double helix, while shells L and M which are more energetic with 2 and 3, etc. Let's see this in practice. Let us first isolate the 3s subshell of the M shell from the whole magnesium atom. This self-referential development looks like convection or smoke rising and subsequently falling as I make this subshell swirl around itself. The two electrons in this subshell have a phase difference of pi upon 2 because there are only two, while in the case of the 2p complete subshell, as we shall soon see, I have depicted the trajectories as having a phase difference of pi upon 6 because there are 6. It seems here that electrons in a subshell must share the phase difference of 180 degrees, as this structure is symmetrical, making a zero phase trajectory identical to a pi phase trajectory. In this simplistic model, I don't make use of Pauli's exclusion principle, but I will later on. Such a depiction of the atom does not agree with the current atomic theory, but I have depicted it as such, to begin with, for simplicity, and also because the L shell looks very similar to the depiction of the atom attempted by Babbitt in 1878. Later on, I will show you a more accurate depiction of the atom, producing thus elliptical trajectories where appropriate. The current model, where the electrons in the 1s subshell have a phase difference of pi upon 2, cannot account for the two electrons having opposite spin either. Yet once we discover what spin is within this presentation, then we will be able to depict the trajectories of each pair of electrons more accurately. Please be patient. Let's first take a look at the first electron of the two in the M shell, whose phase equals to 0. You can now see the convection better as I make this electron's trajectory swirl around itself. The s orbital, irrespective of the turns, is always a double torus or else an apple. This is the apple. This is the apple on whose surface the electron travels. By subtracting one electron at a time, one can produce a step-by-step depiction of the first 12 atoms of the periodic table, all the way down to the hydrogen atom, whose self-referential development of its single electron is assumed to be identical to the meaning of order's eternal development around the universe, rendering the universe and the hydrogen atom one and the same. Yet we can only view any phenomenon as though there is a fixed frame of reference, and so we fail to identify the two as one. I mean the atom and the whole universe. We do know, though, that after the Big Bang, the first atom to be produced is the hydrogen atom. Well, in this self-referential depiction of the universe and of the atom itself, space is curved around a circle, both on the macrocosmic scale as well as on the microcosmic, while also the Big Bang is a continuous phenomenon, eternally. Yes, but what about all the other subnuclear particles we know to exist? How does such a depiction account for them? You would also be right to ask, how do you depict the four fields or forces in such a description of the atom? Well, according to the theory the meaning of order's interpretation, mass is only curved space around a circle and nothing else, while it also curves the neighboring space around it, creating thus the only phenomenologically real force of gravity, as has been shown by the general theory of relativity, which only holds true, according to the theory the meaning of order, in every locality where the speed of light is virtually constant. It is also the peculiarities of such a self-referential depiction of the atom that appear as separate entities within the atom, while such a self-referential description demands the indivisibility of the whole universe and of the atom as well. By indivisibility, I mean that they're discerned by the linear mind part. Any part or object at all has no intrinsic reality. It is only phenomenologically real or apparently real. The part is shown to continuously alter itself as space is also continuously being altered on our journey around the universe. It will be understood that it also acts as being conscious of the rest of the universe, while also observation alone is shown to immediately alter the part, making the part a very different entity to what we linearly discern it to be. Furthermore, all four forces are just apparent forces or phenomenological forces whose reality depends upon our linear interpretation. Finally, free electrons can be thought of as retaining their ability to somehow curve space around them, and so they appear as having mass, while within the atom, electrons are just waves in fully curved space. The same principle applies to all free occurring particles. This is a new way to interview the wave-particle duality. Furthermore, one can easily imagine the standing waves produced by such an electron wave within the atom, just as Louis de Broglie proposed, where possibly the standing waves at the center provide the boundaries of what we phenomenologically discern as the nucleus. What I'm trying to say is that the atom is just space curved as already depicted, or similar, and nothing else, apart from the minimum energy trapped within it that we call electron. Everything else is a byproduct produced by the particular self-referential development, which demands space to be intricately curved, just as in the case of the whole universe. The universe and the hydrogen atom are one and the same, but viewed from a different frame of reference. This, of course, remains an assumption, but a self-referentially valid one, and so is that the nucleus is defined by the spherical harmonics exhibited by such a self-referential structure. Yet if one were to unwrap this curved space of the atom that also curves its surrounding space, then that would result in the production of gravitational as well as electromagnetic waves whose total energy was calculated correctly by Einstein. Having already depicted the atom, and while I was compiling this presentation, I came across Babbitt's ultimate atom, which was depicted and published in 1878 and bears uncanny resemblance to the meaning of orders depiction. Please Google it. I am yet to read the book, but hopefully I will find some time in the future to do so. Please notice that Babbitt's atom is also a self-referential development, depicting a double helix that originates from and finally folds back to itself continuously. I don't know what he called it, yet he seems to be conscious of the fact that such a depiction could not possibly be a rational one, and so his book is presented as a theosophical account of science. Also notice the group of three trajectories in Babbitt's atom, which in the meaning of orders depiction, the middle one is of the 2s subshell, while the two adjacent ones, 15 degrees either side, are of the 2p subshell. I hope you can see the cursor. These are the three trajectories here, while in this depiction, in the meaning of orders depiction, should we take out the M shell, we have the three trajectories here, where this middle one is of the 2s subshell, while these two are of the 2p subshell. What I urge you to clearly understand is that in this self-referential universe of ours, everything is continuously and concurrently creating its opposite, while also including it. So the macrocosm creates its opposite, the microcosm, while also including it. This, of course, may be easy to swallow by our linear minds, but the opposite, which is equally true, is not. by which the microcosm creates its opposite, the macrocosm, while also including it. It is this that makes every field of investigation unfathomable, much like a fractal is. This is because the frame of reference is being altered continuously in such a self-referential universe, while our linear mind can only think and depict reality as having a fixed frame of reference, which in turn allows the production of only a linear description from a beginning, within which the opposites are necessarily mutually exclusive. In reality, the whole, which includes everything, cannot be referenced to anything external, and so the whole can only be self-referential. On the contrary, our linear mind, in its attempt to describe anything, attempts only a linear depiction that must be inaugurated by an arbitrary but plausible beginning, axiom or principle, and such a linear depiction of our self-referential universe cannot include everything, creating thus always segregation of knowledge. Yet, a self-referential description of the whole, which cannot be thought of as being purely physical or scientific, includes everything, unifying thus also all fields of knowledge. Something that our rational description, which is necessarily linear, cannot at all do. So it must be clearly understood that the unified theory for all can only be implemented on a self-referential basis. Similarly, a self-referential description of the whole cannot be purely physical or else purely scientific. So, a physicist, a biologist, or a philosopher relying solely on a rational description of reality, where the frame of reference is fixed and the description exclusively linear, digs deeper and deeper into the fabric of existence in order to find the beginning, by which all can be explained, but in vain. This happens because such a linear description is also always unfathomable, because it reproduces itself like a fractal, depriving thus physics as well as biology, which are both linear, from reaching their goals, depriving also philosophy from reaching truth. The goal of physics is to produce a unified theory for all, while the goal of biology is to produce therapy, both of which are desperately in need of a holistic approach delivered only by self-referentiality. Needless to say that the goal of philosophy is to reach truth, which again is impossible linearly. A deeper analysis, which I don't intend to expose fully in this short presentation, explains that the linear mind, failing to wrap it all up self-referentially, by which order or esoteric silence may be produced, creates the notion of free will and attempts to provide the only available thing in such a description, which is suppression, where instead order is needed. So it is the observer's linear description that creates a society which relies solely upon suppression to provide order, but in vain. So medicine, the law, the military, the church, etc., all provide suppression in their attempt to provide order, but in vain. So our society, which has not reached therapy or order, is compelled to recycle itself continuously. Remnants of such a cycle on our non-eternal planet are the many ancient and often unexplainable achievements of previous civilizations. They are unexplainable because we naturally assume that evolution is linear. A self-referential description of evolution, though, reveals the role of illness as the steam engine of evolution. Additionally, it also reveals therapy, which leads to health and longevity, that is, virtual immortality. The latter is reached by cymatically inhibiting any evolution of our genetic information. But the detailed technological implementation of such an understanding belongs to another chapter altogether. You're being called to understand, though, that a self-referential description always reaches truth immediately and does not attempt to do so by trial and error. You're also being called to understand that it is the linearity of our mind that creates its opposite, the non-linearity of objective reality eternally, while also including it, and vice versa. The opposite, of course, is easier to grasp. Similarly, it is the linearity of the Cartesian space that allows us to depict such a self-referential development where nothing at all is linear. Let us go back to the self-referential structure of the hydrogen atom, which is identical to the structure of the universe itself, and investigate cosmology, or else the macrocosm, before coming back to the interpretation of the atom. I hope that you can see the cursor here. So, this self-referential development is complete over 4 pi. Like it goes all the way round, that's 2 pi, and then another 2 pi, it goes all the way round this way. It represents the trajectory of a ray of light emanating from the center, which is where the continuous Big Bang takes place, and such ray propagates along a straight line following the curvature of space. The first 2 pi are characterized by a continuous positive curvature of space, while after the center, the curve depicts space as having negative curvature. It will be understood that the first 2 pi depict the observable universe, or else the field of matter, while the last 2 pi depict the field of antimatter, where the curvature of space is inverted. The center of this structure represents the continuous Big Bang, where everything is being recycled eternally. Let me also depict an inner cycle and an adjacent one, so that the field of expansion may be discernible. So let's show these two. This is where the Big Bang takes place, and after the Big Bang everything is expanding just as showing here. So this field of expansion really extends all the way to the middle of the turn, 1 pi, and after that there is a continuous contraction, which in the last quarter is accelerated, very similar to the expansion in the first quarter, which is also accelerated. The same thing, of course, happens to the field of antimatter. In such a self-referential universe, everything creates its opposite, and so the field of expansion is complemented concurrently by a field of contraction in both fields of matter and of antimatter. In order to see the field of expansion in the field of antimatter, I have to extend the cycles to 3 pi, to 4 pi in total, but I start from minus pi. So here we see that a field of expansion, then a field of contraction in the field of matter, and now for the second 2 pi we go to the field of antimatter, where there is a field of expansion and then a field of contraction. In fact, if we add any 2 opposites, we always get the whole. So if we add the field of matter and the field of antimatter, we get the whole, which is 0. If we add the fields of expansion, which are the 2 top ones, and the field of contraction, which are the fields of contraction, which are the 2 bottom ones, then again we get the whole, which again is 0. A parametric surface depiction of our universe, including the field of antimatter, is shown as following, where the field of matter is depicted in blue color and the field of antimatter in red. It is this. This is the whole universe. Please notice that the belly of the apple is in fact the Tao symbol yin-yang. Of course, we observe our universe as being a complete sphere and not as half an apple or half a double torus. But the fact that the speed of light being proportional to the radius of curvature of space in any locality makes this half look like a whole sphere where there is no room for the symmetrical other half to be expanded. In fact, the field of antimatter is expanded in a space of negative curvature past the continuous Big Bang, and so we are forever excluded from directly observing such a development. It must though be clearly understood that the field of antimatter is symmetrical to the field of matter in every respect, so that together they amount to zero at all times. The theory, the meaning of order, demands also that nothing is constant in this eternal development, so consequently the speed of light is variable. You're now being called to understand that existence is only a temporally and spatially unbounded bubble of nested apples, so that this symmetrical self-referential structure equals to zero at all times, making existence only an expression of non-existence. Such a self-referential structure was never born and will never die, while on the whole, there never is any change, as altogether equals to zero at all times, making existence again only a self-referential expression of non-existence. So self-referentially one can say that non-existence creates existence while also including it, and vice versa. The yin-yang symbol of Tao depicts exactly this, while also the parametric surface depiction of the apple has a belly that looks exactly like the particular symbol, clearly indicating that previous civilizations on our non-eternal planet had at various times in the past understood self-referentiality and had the technology to depict it adequately. Surprisingly, the part, any object or conglomeration of objects at all, constitutes the field of becoming in Buddhist terms, where everything changes in time, while the whole, being zero, represents the field of being, where nothing really exists, not even time. In Buddhist terms, which is not a religion, but could possibly simply be understood as a self-referential description of existence, the whole is known to be indivisible, timeless, empty, and immovable, simply because it is zero. Time, on the other hand, only exists after the linearity of the eternally present observer's mind has discerned the phenomenological reality of the part in a field which altogether can only be characterized by non-existence. So time has always existed in the field of becoming, and so is the observer. Yet, our linear mind can never see the whole, and so it relies solely on the asserted reality of the part. In this analysis, the part is always subject to change due to observation as well, as the part and the rest of the universe add up to the whole, which equals to zero, and are therefore complementary and opposite. So any information created about the part by observation changes the rest of the universe by the information created. And this alone changes the part which is opposite to the rest of the universe. These two examples, as well as others, agree totally with quantum mechanics, by which the universe cannot be inaugurated in the absence of the observer, and also that observation affects the phenomenon. In fact, it will be understood that in such a self-referential universe, the observer has always been present eternally. Yet planet Earth was truly born several billion years after the continuous Big Bang, and is therefore non-eternal. Matter is always produced at a certain point in time after the continuous Big Bang, and so is life, as the universe, which is a double helix, continuously creates itself by means of the atom and of the cell, which both include double helices. As the field of matter is characterized by a complete turning in all three dimensions, then matter is created always at a particular angle, theta, after the continuous Big Bang, while also life is created at a particular angle, theta 2, that is greater than theta. We also currently live in a field characterized by an angle theta 3, that is greater than theta 2. The universe has been eternally self-similar when viewed from the vicinity characterized of any angle theta. The field of becoming can be seen as the first derivative with respect to time of the field of being, while on the whole, both equal to zero. This is because the field of being, which is the whole that equals to zero, is the integral across time or across a complete turn, or in fact across any 2 points in time of the field of becoming, simply because the fields of matter and antimatter are symmetrical in every respect. Lately, by the use of very powerful telescopes, including those in space like the Hubble, we have managed to map the observable universe to an unprecedented accuracy, by which we observe what is called the dipole universe. We observe a bright region in the sky called the repellent, which is surrounded by a field of expansion, and we also observe a bright region called the attractor, surrounded by a field of contraction. Miraculously, we observe that the repellent, the observer, and the attractor are on a straight line, and this is thought to be a coincidence. Well, the observer, that is us, is to be found in the first quarter of the field of expansion, here, where there is nonlinear expansion, and looking in the one direction, one sees the Big Bang at the center of the field of expansion. When the observer that is here looks down this way, it sees the Big Bang. While looking in the other direction, it sees the Big Bang again, but in the center of the field of contraction. The repellent and the attractor are actually the same thing, which is none other than the continuous Big Bang, simply because space is curved around a complete circle in the field of matter. Yet such a circling is not a two-dimensional continuous turning, and so it is not an exact circle. It is a continuous circling in all three dimensions that can only be represented accurately by the self-referential depiction provided. Let us consider the space included by two adjacent trajectories and their inner counterparts as they develop around the universe. They represent a bracelet. It is this. This is the bracelet. It is already understood that such a development is like a rope that circles the universe. It must now also be understood that for a complete turn of 2 pi of this rope, there is also a twist of the rope of 1 pi. Such a twist represents the spin of the electron in the case of the hydrogen atom, as was very accurately pointed out by cosmologist Wes Johnson. So, in reality, the atom is more complicated than how it was earlier depicted. one can express the significance of all four quantum numbers n, l, m, and s using the self-referential depiction of it herewith, while also depicting each subshell with its respective spherical harmonics. The n quantum number is already depicted correctly as different shells have increasingly bigger radii, while also the shell is represented by a double helix with an n number of turns. The L and M quantum numbers introduced by Sommerfeld can be depicted by presenting the subshells as identical to the spherical harmonics derived by quantum mechanics as probability distributions of how every pair of electrons with opposite spin occupies the space around the atom. In the depiction of the atom already presented, the pair of electrons in the one subshell were presented as having a phase difference of pi upon 2. In this newer model, the two electrons in every such pair are presented as having opposite developments and therefore opposite spin. These two trajectories cross their paths because they developed opposite to each other. And so they have opposite spin also. You may see this clearer in the 3s trajectories, where the one trajectory is rising while the other one is falling, just because they have opposite developments. Now, I'm sorry for the wobble of this structure here. You should by now be acquainted with the idea that the atom of hydrogen and the universe itself are one and the same. What changes is the perspective, or else the frame of reference. The universe is observed from the inside, while the atom from the outside. So the atom includes a whole universe, as there is no beginning and the cycle keeps repeating. In linear terms, this looks like a fractal, while the field under investigation is bound to be termed as unfathomable, once it is clearly understood that the beginning must always elude us. Yet self-referentially one can see that going from the macrocosm to the microcosm, one completes the circle where the atom and the whole universe are one and the same. Much like the atom, the universe always creates the cell also, as it too is a manifestation of the same thing, including also a double helix, just as the atom does. The apple, which is both the universe itself and the S subshell of the atom, much like the cell, it must divide in order to populate the more energetic P subshell. In biology, the process is called mitosis. Surprisingly, the same process applies to the atom. I have Googled spherical harmonics and it shows me several pages showing what the probabilistic distributions of the positions of the electron around the atom. So this is a sphere, and this is an apple, and this is an apple that has gone through mitosis. In fact, this is a sphere that has gone through mitosis also. So let's find out how that works. This is an apple with its axis on the x-axis. This is the x-axis. By the introduction of a couple of signs, the apple undergoes mitosis, and it shows us exactly the shape of the distribution of the electrons' trajectories around the 2p subshell. Now, we will later find out that the P subshell, the S subshell in fact, could better be depicted by a sphere rather than an apple. Now, by the introduction of these two cosines, this apple becomes a sphere, while by introducing again a couple of signs, we have an apple, we have a sphere that goes through mitosis and produces the px orbitals. Anyway, rather than using the parameter v as an offset within the cosine here, I'm using it as so as to replace the quantum number n, in which case the trajectory of the electron portrays a propeller. Now, if I turn it, this is probably the most efficient and silent propeller there is, where the electron travels on the outer edge or the cutting edge of this propeller. Now, the cutting edge travels along the surface of the apple, of course. I hope you can understand what I'm depicting here. I think you have already understood why the apple must, or the sphere, must go through mitosis in order to produce the px, py, and pz orbitals, in which case we can have we can depict all three px, py, and pz the three orbitals of the 2p subshell as an apple that has gone through mitosis. If we introduce a cosine u in each of these expressions, then we find that the pz, this is the pz, is now a sphere that has gone through mitosis. And if we do the same thing to the other two, either way, we have a complete representation of the complete P subshell. Let me make it turn for you to see. You can also use this page called CalPlot 3D to depict these equations yourself, these curves, these solids also. Reality seen linearly as an unfathomable field is a fractal that necessarily exhibits a fractal dimensionality that also cannot be constant. At present, in our locality, it is very close to 3 for obvious reasons. This is probably the reason that a trajectory upon completing a full circle begins a new one off step, covering thus the whole surface of the orbital, or better, in fact, the whole volume of the orbital. Something that would be impossible if the fractal dimension of the universe were exactly 3. Such understanding can be depicted by introducing a time-dependent offset that forces the electron to occupy the whole orbital surface. Similarly, an additional variable scalar at the beginning of these expressions will cover the whole volume. So I put this offset, time-dependent offset, in both these equations, but I also made this quantum number n, which equals to 2 in the particular case, to fluctuate between 1 and 3. I made a whole turning of 90 pi so that there is enough room to turn, and that's why there is a divided by 90 here. It's from minus pi to plus 89 pi. And of course I gave it 10,000 points to depict. In this case, the circle has gone through mitosis, but the electron is to be found anywhere within it. Finally, one could rightly argue that the cycle from the macrocosm to the microcosm does not end with a hydrogen atom, but with a much smaller neutrino. And so it might be the neutrino that should be depicted as the universe itself. Accordingly, the 1s subshell of the atom of the hydrogen atom could be depicted by the more energetic structure of a sphere. The principle, though, remains the same. I say the more energetic structure because it includes a cosine.
This spherical orbital of a single turn represents the atom of hydrogen probably better than the apple can, while the spherical orbital of many turns surprisingly represents accurately the living cell. The living cell, as well as the S_shell of the atom, undergo mitosis in order that the former creates all the living organisms while the latter populates the P subshell, creating thus all the elements of the periodic table.
A self-referential description of existence totally changes the way we should be viewing the universe and all within it also. Hopefully, better mathematicians and physicists than myself will complete this model to display all the subshells correctly, according to current observations. I am mainly interested in explaining that only a self-referential description can depict the whole and provide finally all the answers, including therapy, which is not fully discussed herewith, allowing thus physics, biology and philosophy to complete their goals by a single description that also unites them. This is possible because the universe is fully deterministic, as we will later see, and also indivisible, as we might better understand later on. Yet it is only order and therapy that can deliver humanity to its destiny, while we're currently navigating through the field of evolution with neither a compass nor a map. The universe being fully deterministic allows me to talk about destiny, in fact. We also fail to understand that the modulated cymatical information of our environment, due to the chemical contamination imposed upon it by the industry, necessarily demands the fast-track evolution of our genetic information. Simply because our genetic information is only coded into our DNA by self-organization induced by the cymatical information of the cell, of its environment, and finally of our environment, deterministically and thus directly, and certainly not by natural selection, which implies a trial and error approach. This universe does not work on trial and error. Only humans do, because we are compelled to produce only a linear description, which in turn is not an accurate representation of any development in objective reality. And so we always need the experiment to confirm or negate our linear understanding. We're being blind, that is. On the contrary, a self-referential description is applicable everywhere accurately and immediately. So our universe does not produce a multitude of redundant organisms where only a few are meant to survive and reproduce by adapting to their environment. This fully deterministic universe demands the evolution of the cell so as to match the cymatical information of its organism. Similarly, it demands the evolution of the organism so as to match the cymatical information of its environment. This process is continuous, as the environment is also subject to evolution as well, forming a circle, which always characterizes a self-referential development that has no beginning and no end. The first cell that appeared on our non-eternal planet was only an enclosed membrane that included some matter, which in turn was structured by the cymatical information of its environment to implement the universe itself within it, that is, to include a double helix, just as in the case of the hydrogen atom. Yet biologists who are in general ignorant of physics, and of self-referentiality of course, cannot at all abide by such an interpretation, despite the fact that it was Nobel Prize awarded professor of biology Ilya Prigozhin who first identified the phenomenon of self-organization half a century ago. Biologists still believe that mutations are random or errors of the cell, because the linear definition of evolution goes as follows. Random mutations take place within an organism where the resulting organism's ability to survive and reproduce depends upon the organism's ability to adapt to its environment, which is a linear description with amazingly a non-deterministic beginning. Yet a self-referential description of evolution reveals immediately and accurately the role of illness as the steam engine of evolution. Try it. The cymatical information of the organism is a measurable quantity. By recording the organism's response to a magnetic Dirac delta function and subsequently processing the result by Fourier transform, while illness is the excess cymatical information of the organism over and above its state of health. Something that, to my knowledge, no biologist can readily understand. Remember that a self-referential description is cyclical. On the contrary, this linear definition of evolution, despite the fact that it is wrong because it is not deterministic, totally hides the role of illness and thus of therapy being linear, allowing thus medicine to deliver only rehabilitation and suppression, while therapy is well beyond a linear description. At any rate, the YouTube video The End of Segregation of Knowledge, despite its shortcomings, reveals the role of therapy adequately. Fortunately or unfortunately, my ability to describe self-referentiality changes through time, revealing some mistakes in older descriptions, while also possibly allowing for new ones in the current one. Self-organization is an entropy-defying phenomenon by which the cymatical information within any enclosure determines its structure by the standing waves produced. Both the cell as well as the atom have structures that are determined accordingly by the spherical harmonics produced. The waves produced by friction travel along the surface of this table and get reflected once they reach the surface's boundaries, upon which standing waves are produced, where the sand rests on the nodes of these standing waves as they don't vibrate. If the medium is one-dimensional like the string of a guitar, the nodes are single points, producing the different harmonics, whereas on a two-dimensional medium like this tabletop, the nodes form curved lines. In the case of the cell, though, which is a three-dimensional confined medium, the nodes are curved surfaces, which define the relative spherical harmonics that also provide a definite bias according to which the amino acids within are to align themselves along the double helix of the DNA. The sizes and shapes of these amino acids also play a role. This process within the cell is continuous, and though the cell is subject to mutating continuously, when appropriate of course, as also the newly founded field of biology called epigenetics understands. This is the way the cell hard copies a chronic illness and records it on its DNA, which is then obliged to reproduce, while therapy of a chronic illness necessarily demands the deletion of such information from the cell or from the majority of the cells of the organism, modulating thus its total cymatical information and returning the organism to health. A process that cannot be instantaneous. On the other hand, therapy of an acute illness can be instantaneous, as the cymatical deviation has not yet been hard copied. The long-term memory of the brain hard copies its information probably much the same way, while every organ in the body is surrounded by a membrane or a hymen that works like a Gaussian surface or a damper, allowing every organ to exhibit a cymatical information that is exclusive to itself and which also compels its cells to structure accordingly, but differently from the cells of neighboring organs. So if we want to inhabit our solar system, where each planet comes with its own cymatical environment, we must first conquer therapy and provide it continuously, by which also virtual immortality is achievable, forcing thus the cymatical information of the organism to revolve around a tight circle whose center is the state of health of the organism. Remember that in our self-referential universe nothing is constant. The state of health of the organism is shown to be a single point in a 1 billion dimensional space, whose axes are the frequencies derived by the Fourier transform. Moreover, if we want to help humanity from altogether withering away imminently, completing thus its circle once more, therapy must become a total priority before any other scientific research. It must be clearly understood that no one is immune to the modulated energy of our environment due to the chemical contamination, while the only abode is continuous therapy. Furthermore, therapy naturally comes under the field of knowledge of electrical engineering rather than of biology. Such is the travesty of our linear description, which imposes segregation of knowledge. You might have gathered so far that the single description offered herewith, which is also nonlinear, being self-referential, attempts to decipher accurately and immediately every aspect of existence without trial and error. And this is the reason that I move freely from one subject to the next, as though nothing separates them. Because truly nothing does, apart from our mind, which to date invariably attempts only a linear description. Please also notice that it was the cosmological model which made clear the nature of the electron spin. So, it is about time to end the segregation of knowledge imposed by our linear interpretation. Let's go back to cosmology. Such a self-referential universe demands that only half the light observed by cosmologists can be attributed to a particular light source on the sky, while the other half cannot. This is because life that is shone towards the sky cannot escape to infinity, but it progressively enters areas with continuously higher or else continuously lower radii of curvature, depending on the direction through the layers of nested apples, where it gets continuously refracted until it is tangent to a trajectory back to the origin. This is because the speed of light is proportional to the radius of curvature of space in any locality. So half the light that astronomers observe cannot be attributed to a particular light source on the sky, an observation that is currently linearly unexplainable. It should by now be clear that this self-referential universe has a field of expansion after the continuous Big Bang and a field of contraction just before it as well, for both fields of matter as well as of antimatter, and so the whole, which can never be linearly discerned, is ever unchangeable, being symmetrical and thus zero, while what can be linearly discerned can never be constant. This, of course, includes all the constants admitted by physicists. You may also like to think that the definite or indefinite integral of reality must equal to zero, and so reality cannot incorporate a constant term. It goes without saying that the linear depiction of the universe cannot account for the missing antimatter, while a self-referential one can. The turbulence observed in all levels of magnification is easily justified by this self-referential model, just as are other numerous observations. So such a self-referential description of reality does not need the introduction of dark matter and dark energy to explain observations such as the non-linear expansion and the missing matter in our universe. Please take into account the field of antimatter and also the curvature of space. Furthermore, the structure of the black hole, as predicted by the general theory of relativity, is shown not to hold true, simply because the speed of light is shown not to be constant, but proportional to the radius of curvature of space in any locality. Such conclusion does not discredit Einstein's theory. It simply complements it, as the general theory of relativity has correctly concluded that gravity is only a phenomenologically real force, or else an apparent force, due to the curvature of space. In reality, we need more complex mathematics than Riemann's geometry in order to depict the curvature of space accurately in a universe where the speed of light is variable. Short of such a solution, one can rely on the trajectories that circle the universe to depict the curvature of space accurately. This alters the structure of the supermassive black holes, which appear to be pockets of inverted space, similar to the field of antimatter, rendering such a pocket open, invisible, and able to squirt antimatter, which creates the ionized environment of the Fermi bubbles in the field of interaction of the antimatter squirted with the surrounding matter. So life can only develop in the outskirts of a galaxy and not in the hostile environment of the Fermi bubbles. This might sound like a long shot to a linear mind, but a self-referential analysis demands that the field of matter creates its opposite, the field of antimatter, while also including it. This holds true because the circle is always evident whichever pair of opposites we may choose to investigate, while the opposites are not mutually exclusive in such a self-referential description, which in turn only attempts to expand the same way any phenomenon does, and this is the reason that such a description is always accurate. You will be surprised to find out that quantum mechanics does exactly the same thing. This completes the presentation of the self-referential atom as being one and the same with the universe itself. I would now like to elaborate swiftly on the question, why quantum mechanics? Well, it should by now be obvious that the self-referentiality of objective reality cannot at all be fully deciphered by a mechanistic or irrational description, where the frame of reference is fixed to something external, as such a frame of reference imposes linearity to the description itself. So every rational description or scientific theory is bound to fail at some point, as it always attempts to describe the non-linear self-referential reality linearly. So every theory, apart from quantum mechanics, which incidentally is not a linear theory, is bound to fail at some point. Similarly, every rational conclusion, including all knowledge derived rationally, must be marked as not a safe abode, simply because they have been reached by a description that can never be entirely accurate, but also because everything changes around a circle eternally. On the other hand, quantum mechanics, having admitted psi to be equal to e to the power of I times kx minus omega t, which inherently admits that what is observed necessarily develops around a circling, does not provide a linear interpretation of reality and is therefore non-mechanistic, non-rational, and thus unintelligible, while it also expresses exactly what the meaning of order's self-referential depiction expresses, where everything follows a continuous circling in all three dimensions. This is what makes quantum mechanics unique and entirely accurate in its field of application, while on the contrary, a rational description can only be virtually accurate only in the vicinity of the observer, where space is virtually linear, but never in the microcosm, and finally not in the microcosm either, where space is also curved around a circle. The meaning of order, with its ever-curving self-referential depiction, in fact, provides exactly the same solution that quantum mechanics provides to Schrödinger's equation, but not probabilistically. Yet for a whole century, and to Einstein's dismay, we have insisted on the Copenhagen interpretation simply because we refuse to admit that everything is on a track to complete a circle eternally, to which turbulence is also a direct consequence. So we can accept only a probabilistic approach to Schrödinger's equation, while at the same time our linear mind insists that the Big Bang theory, because of its linearity, must be right. And so we insist that reality is only a linear expansion from an arbitrary but plausible beginning, which must be understood that it is only a direct copy of how the mind builds its rational description. So rather than building a description that reflects what is observed accurately, we cling to rationality that certainly imposes linearity upon its field of investigation. This is because, throughout a rational description, we always refer to the same frame of reference to which we cling to, while on the contrary, reality itself, being the opposite of the linear mind, offers no fixed frame of reference and is thus exclusively nonlinear, as also the solution to Schrödinger's equation demands. Short of spraining one's brain with this mind-twisting helter-skelter, one must clearly understand that the subatomic world and the superatomic world are one and the same. In fact, the opposites always are the same, as Freud also suggested, and this is the reason we crucify him to date. In fact, everything always wraps into its opposite after a complete circle, while both opposites are the same thing, each seen from a different frame of reference. So also, the macrocosm wraps into the microcosm and vice versa. In assistance to what I'm trying to put across, I would also like to state that the classical notion of determinism where the present depends upon the past alone is a direct result of the linearity of our rational description and is only applicable in a universe characterized by linear space, which is an impossibility, of course. Similarly, the classical notion of determinism is only applicable, virtually applicable, in the vicinity of the observer where space is virtually linear. On the contrary, in our self-referential universe where everything is compelled to be on a track to complete a circle eternally, due to which cause precedes but also follows the effect, both being on a circle, the present depends upon the past and the future alike everywhere, even subatomically. This means that the universe is fully deterministic everywhere, but not with a classical notion of determinism, and so there is no room for free will to put a wedge in the fabric of existence, as very well put by Tao Master Lao Tzu himself ages ago. So, although I might be thought of as a challenger of Einstein's theories, in fact the opposite is true. The theory, the meaning of order, agrees with Einstein and David Bohm in every area that matters, while also it complements and completes their work. In fact, it was Einstein himself who was apprehensive about the constancy of the speed of light. There cannot be such a constant, but without such assumption there would be no theory, he said. Thank you, Einstein. He is probably the only scientist that ever undermined his own work for the sake of truth. As of lately, quantum mechanics has addressed the above issue of determinism, delivering what is known as quantum causal loops. Yet only self-referentiality can wrap it all up into one single description. Apart from that, one may also extend the jurisdiction of non-probabilistic quantum mechanics to apply to the superatomic world as well. Either, of course, will suffice, by which superconductivity will also find a viable description. all without trial and error and without experimentation. Everything can be accurately described by a single self-referential description directly, simply because such a description is expanded exactly as any self-referential development in objective reality. I would also like to state that Buddhism, as taught by Gautama, is not a religion, but it could simply be understood as a self-referential description of existence where the observer realizes introspectively that nothing separates one from the whole in this indivisible universe, apart from the linearity of one's mind, which must thereafter be transcended. An action that is possible because it is the linearity of the ever-present observer's mind that creates the non-linearity of objective reality eternally, while also including it. An understanding that also explains consciousness, which again is twofold, the linear and the self-referential. The innate ability of anything we linearly discern to move according to everything else in the universe with no time lapse, much like dough is needed, bestows upon the part consciousness of the rest of the universe as quantum mechanics also understands. Such a phenomenon is none other than the entanglement of everything to everything else with no time lapse, as the universe is indivisible and the part is only apparently real. Yet we can only discern symmetrical particles that are entangled to each other while we linearly understand the rest of the universe to be unaffected. On the contrary, we attribute consciousness to any living organism that perceives its environment and defends itself from any threat all the way down to the cell and beyond it to the virus. One could say that such a consciousness is already linear, as the reality of the part has been asserted in the organism's description, however primitively. Furthermore, we also attribute higher consciousness to an organism that recognizes itself, that has a sense of identity, separating thus subject from object rationally. Yet awareness, as Jiddu Krishnamurti uses the term, can only develop once the linearity of the mind has been transcended, where the reality of the part is no more asserted in any way, and the person has no established sense of identity and thus takes nothing personally, having one's mind free of any object in his words. No one can hurt such an innocent person, according to Jiddu Krishnamurti. Such a person is clearly entangled to the rest of the universe. Well, everybody else is also entangled, of course, but while relying solely on a linear interpretation, where free will prevails, one is subject to making mistakes, having regrets, while also hurting themselves and others simply by attempting to provide order through suppression. Only because linearity, not being able to reach order, produces always linear conflict, where the mind is clearly not silent. It is in fact racing. It is busy producing always a linear description that is inadequate and is thus racing to produce yet another. The silent mind, on the other hand, is self-referential, and so it depicts reality accurately and directly with no time lapse, as its description is not built up linearly in discrete consequential steps in time, but it builds its description in one gulp, timelessly. This is because such a mind is entangled with reality and knows it without a single thought. Such a mind is also non-mechanistic, as very well explained also by Jiddu Krishnamurti. The whole is the union of any two opposites, and so is linearity and non-linearity put together. At last, one must understand that this self-referential universe of ours produces what we linearly discern as dualities everywhere. So everything can be depicted as developing in time, just as classical physics understands, while also concurrently everything must be understood to be entangled to everything else timelessly, like clockwork. just as quantum mechanics could also understand. Well, self-referentiality describes both in one single description. So any development whatsoever, like me lifting my hand, is a product of the whole universe. This explains fully the indivisibility of the universe. Thank you.